Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an immense pleasure to be here with you. My name is Saif Awad, and I'm the Data Management and Results Monitoring Officer at the UN Resident Coordinator Office here in the UAE. As I said, it's my immense pleasure, and on behalf of the UN Resident Coordinator Office, Dr. Dina Assaf, I'd like to welcome you all to this latest webinar session of 28 for 28. A webinar series that discusses the important topics surrounding climate change and climate action. Today's session is titled Climate Action and Human Values. As human beings, we possess an innate sense of what is right and wrong. We are capable of empathy, compassion, and kindness. And these values form the basis of our inner moral code. These values are also what drive us to take action when we see injustice or suffering, whether it be in our own communities or on a global scale. And yet, despite our best intentions, we have failed to address one of the greatest challenges facing humanity, climate change. This is a crisis that threatens not only our natural environment, but our way of life. So how can we reconcile our human values with the urgent need for climate action? Today, we are pleased to have with us Dr. Iyad Moghli from the Faith for Earth initiative at the UN Environment Program, UNEP. He will be able to shed some light on this idea and this topic, and we welcome him immensely. We are also pleased to welcome commentary from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, and from the Global Tolerance Alliance. We have a lot to get through, so without further ado, Mr. Iyad, Dr. Iyad, the floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much, Saif, and thanks to Dina and the entire UN office in the Emirates. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I will start sharing my presentation, and I'm delighted that we're doing this at this moment in preparation for COP28. And I hope that you can see my presentation and hear me well. So again, thank you and happy Ramadan to everybody. I hope this month will be a month of reflections to everybody, especially reflections on our impact on the environment and what can we do to reduce that impact for a better future for everybody. So today I will be talking about the role of faith-based organizations and why we are specifically launching or have launched a program for engaging with faith organizations and faith actors. As Saif mentioned, we are facing unprecedented climate change impact. And we keep saying that the root causes for our attitude towards nature and what has, become a climate impact or biodiversity loss or pollution is actually underlined by other crises, which we call the crisis of ethics and values and moral responsibility. The UN Secretary General said that it is nothing less than a moral, ethical, and economic imperative to take more action to mitigate the existential threat posed by climate change. Our Executive Director, Ms. Inger Anderson, said, "We often forget that protecting nature is not only about us. We also have a moral duty to protect and use wisely the planet, its bounty, and every living being on it." And this has been recognized by the UN by passing a number of resolutions to integrate and work with faith-based organizations and faith actors. And because of that, we have launched the Faith for Earth Coalition, as a mechanism to engage faith actors in policy and decision-making systems on the environment. Therefore, passing through the different industrial revolutions, we found out that we need actually an ethical revolution to be able to integrate ethical and moral values into our economic system. The current economic paradigm is not working. It has led us to where we are today in terms of environmental degradation, although it has led to some economic growth for some countries, but it has not been inclusive and include all of the countries and all of the people. So an ethical approach is very much needed. So there are two types of ethics related to the environment. The environmental ethics, which are derived from norms that in the international community has agreed upon, but in any case, these norms have been relying or have relied on the historical or the norms of ethics and moral principles of religions for the past centuries. So both are not apart, but they are complementary. And this is where we are focusing to bring back the moral responsibility of ethical approaches to living in harmony with nature. So what are some of the types of religious and ethical values related to the environment? Stewardship is known by different religions, especially the Abrahamic ones, where we are considered as stewards of the earth by God. It is called in Islam Khalifa, stewardship in Christianity and Judaism, but also very much related to the interconnectedness and interdependence in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Judaism, and other Eastern religions. The other types of ethics that are related to religions, the ahimsa, which is non-violence with one another, but also non-violence towards nature. All religions and faith organizations currently are using the golden rule, which is do not do unto nature as you wish it to do unto you. So deal with nature as you wish the nature to deal with you, and that is related to also the karma principle in Eastern religions. So why do we engage with religious actors and faith-based organizations? There are several powers that are very important that they bring on board. The first power is the power of convincing and convening. Muslims go to mosques every Friday. Christians go to churches on Sundays. Jews go to synagogues on Saturdays, and there are other religions that they have in special days that they convene to worship God and to practice the rituals that bring them closer to what God has instructed them to do. So the power of convening of religions with a call for a prayer, you would find millions of people gathering together. For example, the Hajj in Islam, where millions and millions of people come together by the Hajj call in 2 or 3 days. Christians go to pilgrimage sites and other religions as well. So the convening power is very important. The convincing power is also important by relying on sacred texts, whether it is the Veda for the Hindus, the Quran for the Muslims, the Bible for Christians and Jews, and what have you. And these messages of God are very much respected by the followers. You can not debate what God has instructed people to say in these sacred scripts. So these are messages that reach the hearts and the minds of the people more than any other message by a UN or a scientist or what have you. The other type of power is the economic power of religions, and they are considered the fourth largest economic power on earth. The religious institutions own more than 8% of habitable land on earth. And that is 36 times the size of the United Kingdom, 2,700 times the size of Singapore, for example. So the amount of assets and investments that faith organizations own is humongous. While this is very important in terms of providing aid support by religious institutions, but also it is very important to be greened and to use green economy and environmentally sustainable approaches to these investments. So accordingly, UNEP created or founded the Faith for Earth Coalition, which is based on three important goals. The first one is to provide a platform for policy dialogue between faith actors and decision makers and politicians. And this happens during the United Nations Environment Assembly, during conventions of the parties, whether it is on climate change or biodiversity or whatever other international multilateral environmental agreements. The second goal is what I mentioned about the power of the faith organizations is greening the faith investments and assets. And the third one is to bridge the understanding between sciences and faith understandings, teachings, and scripts, and make the policy decision is scientifically based, but also relies on the ethics and values of religions. So UNEP has integrated the work with faith actors into its midterm strategy. So we not only rely on what the science says, but also what the sacred scripts are saying about pollution, nature action, and climate action. And it is integrated into the work of different divisions of UNEP. And working with faith organizations is a governance issue. Why is that? Because governance and environmental governance is a set of rules and policy which form and impacts the human behavior. And it relies, of course, on the scientific information for decision makers, but also it engages the public and major stakeholders in the decision-making system. And we have not been integrating the work of faith-based organizations and faith actors as part and parcel of the major groups until recently, when we have been providing that platform for engagement on policy dialogue. The initiative now, it is called the Faith for Earth Coalition, consists of 5 important councils. The first one is the Eminent Faith Leaders Council, which is at the highest level of faith leaders, including Imam al-Azhar for Muslims, for example, or Pope Francis for Christians, Professor Schachter for evangelicals, and so on and so forth. So they come together on one unified voice on different environmental issues. The second council, recognizing the important role of young people, is the Council of Youth or Faith Youth Leaders, where we currently have 22 counselors, 11 men and 11 women. They meet and they debate and they advocate about the role of values into environmental governance. The third council is the Interfaith Women Council, and this is recognizing the important issues related to gender, where they need to be integrated in the work of religious institutions, but also on environmental issues. And the fourth council is a consortium between scientists and religious leaders where we bridge the understanding between science and religion. And the fifth council is a steering committee of the CEOs of faith-based organizations, those who contribute on the ground effective mechanisms to supporting, local communities, and they contribute to the decision making in UNEP, where currently we have, we have 62 accredited faith-based organizations and contribute to the policy making. Climate change is also a religious issue, and how they are integrated. Of course, there are many scripts in the different religions related to climate change, not directly calling it climate change, but it is related to the moral duty and the care for the creation, for example, in Christianity. In Islam, for example, it is about the excessive consumption of resources, the israf, or it is about the balance that was created by God, which is al-mizan. In Buddhism, it is the interconnectedness and dependence between humans and nature, and of course, other religions. So how can faith organizations and faith actors be engaged? It is by mobilizing and campaigning for climate change, providing advocacy and awareness, connecting religions and science, working on legislations with politicians, providing projects to enable people's resilience and adaptation to climate change, and of course issuing political declarations as they have been doing. But also they can do themselves some concrete actions. And there are dozens of millions of houses of worship around the world. In every corner you go, wherever you go, there is a mosque or a church or a synagogue. There are the millions and millions of houses of worship that can be greened by using renewable energy, by using efficient water systems, and by recycling their waste, and so on. So they can contribute. Imagine installing a solar cell on the roof of each of the houses of worship. We're talking about tons and tons of CO2 immediately reduced by doing so. Now, what are some of the concrete examples of projects that have been done by religious institutions? Building resilience, for example, providing some income generating activities and adaptation mechanisms for women in the Philippines by creating some climate related adaptation processes, talking about climate risks by reducing the greenhouse gases in houses of worship, and most importantly, divesting from investing in fossil fuel. And a report was published in 2019 indicating that $11 trillion have already been committed to divestment. Quarter of that is owned by faith-based organizations. So it's a huge potential. So what have these actors been doing during the COPs? Of course, the faith engagement has been there for the past 15 or so years in all of the COPs. Most recently in COP26, where 42 highest faith leaders have met over a period of 9 months, preparing for the COP, and an interfaith, multi-faith statement to call for action, but also to provide some commitments by these leaders have been submitted to the presidency of COP26, and that was held at the Vatican in October 2021. During COP27 last year, more than 50 sessions were held by faith-based organizations. Hundreds of faith leaders and faith actors were there, and they again issued a statement recognizing the importance of the climate crisis, but also calling for the establishment of the loss and damage fund, which fortunately has been established and now working on the implementation mechanisms. For COP28, we're assembling a coordination team. Currently, we have more than 24 faith organizations as part of the coordination team. We're meeting on a monthly basis until we get to COP28, discussing the different, what you call it, sticky issues or sticky points in the negotiations at COP28, bringing science to religions and mobilizing action. So people who attend our meetings go back to their governments and delegates and discuss with them practical actions and what is needed to be done. We're, of course, working on establishing a pavilion with the UNRC office, with the UAE government, and with the Council of Muslim Elders, where we are planning to hold more than 50 sessions over the 2 weeks of the COP, and to come up with not only statements, but we are planning for an after COP sustainable mechanism that keeps the engagement of faith leaders through the Faith for Earth coalition. Our partners include the Vatican, the Council of Muslim Elders, the World Parliament of World Religions, the United Religions Initiative, and many important faith-based organizations and institutions. So I stop here and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Iyad. Honestly, I'm quite impressed and quite surprised by the number of initiatives that are currently in motion by UNEP and the Faith for Earth initiative. I highlight that, and I appreciate your comments on that the climate crisis underlies other crises, ethical and moral, and that the ethical revolution that needs to happen is something that the religious community can enforce. But I also find it very interesting how, in many ways, many of the same ways that people look to the private sector for support and for financial support as well, that the religious community and the religious power of convening and support is also just as valid and just as valuable. Thank you so much. I will now move on to our individual interventions, beginning with our Mr. Benjamin Schachter, who is from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He is a human rights officer there. Benjamin, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Saif and Iyad. So Ben Schachter, I coordinate the work of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Apologies, I seem to. Oh, give me 1 second. So we, I noted with interest Iyad's remarks. We've worked quite closely with faith-based organizations for many years, and faith-based organizations are amongst the major proponents of integrating human rights and climate action and rights-based approaches to climate action. And that's because human rights in many ways reflect a distillation of common values. The extra added value of the human rights framework is that they also come with legally binding obligations. So our work over the past since 2009, mandated by the Human Rights Council, has been to articulate the impacts of climate change on human rights and the corresponding human rights obligations of states and businesses to address those impacts. There is a large volume of work. There's been more than 10 Human Rights Council resolutions explicitly on climate change. that my team handles. There are a number of Human Rights Council resolutions beyond that with a focus on climate change. And there's an increasing emphasis in this area. The other development I want to share, which is relatively recent, is that the Human Rights Council and the United Nations General Assembly in 2021 and 2022, respectively, formally recognized the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And a safe and stable climate is a key element, among others, of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Again, faith-based organizations, indigenous peoples, representative organizations, persons with disabilities, civil society, businesses, a huge multi-stakeholder coalition that worked together to advance this objective clearly show, I think, the degree to which human rights really do reflect a set of common values. Now, I mentioned, I think Iyad has covered, in a sense, the sort of moral and ethical imperative of acting in a certain way to address climate change, at least from a faith-based perspective. But the rights-based approach, as I said, brings in legally binding obligations. So I'll talk about those obligations in a minute, the way that OHCHR has articulated them. And it has also been identified by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its 6th assessment report as absolutely critical to effective policy making. In other words, we have both common sense, legal, and moral and ethical reasons to embrace a rights-based approach and to take rights-based climate action. And that's really the work that OHCHR does and advocates for. So I do want to say a few words about what the obligations are. The first one is to mitigate climate change and prevent its negative human rights impacts. We are already experiencing those impacts at a huge scale. And that's very clear from the IPCC report that was released earlier this week as well. And when something impacts human rights, states have an obligation to take action to address and prevent those negative impacts. There is also an obligation to ensure that people have the capacity to adapt to climate change. It's clear from the IPCC report that some harm that has already been done will be irreversible. And we need to make sure that the people affected have the capacity to adapt. We also need to ensure that they have access to remedy for the harms that they experienced. So that's another key part of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and the human rights framework as a whole. So when we talk about rights-based approaches, key elements include participation and inclusion, access to information, and access to justice and remedy. We also talk about maximum available resources for sustainable human rights-based development, right? There is an obligation to mobilize resources to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights contained within the UN Charter, within the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, to work together to ensure equity in climate action. I think it's important to note as well that these human rights obligations related to climate change are recognized within the Paris Agreement itself, in its preamble, and in many COP decisions following the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And that equity, which corresponds with the idea of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capacities, and fairness and justice and climate justice, is also explicitly contained within the Paris Agreement. We have human rights obligations to ensure that everyone enjoys the benefit of science and its applications. There is a right to science contained in the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights to protect human rights from business harms and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights offer guidance about what this means. But at a minimum, it means that businesses should do no harm. Therefore, businesses which are contributing to climate change are not respecting their responsibility to respect human rights. They're not in compliance with their human rights responsibilities. And there's obligations to ensure equality and non-discrimination, to ensure that no one essentially is left behind, and that the people most vulnerable to climate change have the means to adapt to and survive, frankly, the climate crisis that we are in the midst of, and which will worsen with every incremental increase in global heating. So that's the obligation framework that I wanted to share. I want to say maybe a few more things about what can be done, including at COP28, and then I'll stop there. So COP28 is important for a number of reasons. One is that it will involve the conclusion of the global stocktake, which is a global assessment of how far we are towards achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement. This stocktake should be informed by the work of the IPCC, which was just concluded, and it should inform a ratcheting up of ambition by states, a new nationally determined contribution cycle where states increase their commitments in order to put us back on track to keep global heating below 1.5. And that is a human rights imperative, and we need a strong outcome from the stocktake, and for states to take heed of the stocktake and how dire our current situation is in order to make a more livable planet for current and future generations. There's also work to operationalize a fund on loss and damage. And so the agreement to establish this fund was one of the critical outcomes of COP27. But a lot of the details remain to be determined, including how it's capitalized and who has access to the resources. And it's absolutely critical that this fund be adequately capitalized, that the funds are generated in an equitable way, and that people, particularly those most affected by climate change, have access to the funds. There are a number of other areas, but in the interest of time, I'll perhaps just conclude by emphasizing the importance of having a participatory and inclusive process, which again is a key finding of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we know that having observers in the room, creating ways for them to participate and engage in these negotiations is the best mechanism we have right now for generating accountability, awareness, and action to improve ambition and our prospects of achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin, for your participation, for your intervention. And thank you for highlighting that the human rights-based approach and its obligations are important, and that they are imperative to the COP process, and that they have been highlighted in previous COPs as well. I will leave our questions for till the end of the session, but I also just wanted to remind everyone that we will, this session is recorded, and that all our recordings of all our previous sessions are available online on our YouTube channel. I will now move on to Miss Jyoti Hosagrahar, who is from the UN Scientific Education and Cultural, the Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, who will be providing her intervention at the time. Miss Jyoti, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to join this discussion, which is really a crucial discussion, for inviting UNESCO to join. I will, if you will allow me, share very quickly a short slide presentation. sorry, I'm just getting my slides up. Okay. You should be seeing my slides now. As you're all aware, I'm going to be talking, really focusing a bit on cultural heritage and climate change. And as you're all aware, climate change is the defining issue of our time, and its impact on shared heritage, it's our shared heritage of the world, is unfortunately more apparent than ever, with increasing fires, floods, droughts, desertification, ocean acidification threatening both natural and cultural heritage, while uprooting communities due to climate change is putting entire ways of life at risk, including practice and transmission of living heritage, oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, and festival events. So it contributes to lost economic opportunities in the culture and creative industries and cultural tourism. So adapting to climate change presents a major challenge for the continued preservation and sustainable management of heritage. And there's also a growing appreciation now of the dual role of heritage in climate change mitigation and adaptation. Firstly, in risk prevention, and secondly, as a factor contributing to enhancing resilience. UNESCO mobilized in 2017 a very important document that was mobilized to adopt this document on the declaration of the ethical principles in relation to climate change that focuses specifically on the need to approach the struggle from an ethical point of view. And the declaration sets out a short list of the globally agreed ethical principles that should guide decision-making and policy-making at all levels and help mobilize people to address climate change. So there were different principles that have been elaborated here that include 6 sort of key ideas, such as prevention of harm, precautionary approach, equity and justice, sustainable development, solidarity, and scientific knowledge and integrity in decision making. So UNESCO has been involved on addressing the impact of climate change in culture to promote culture action now for a very long time, and much before this as well. In 2007, UNESCO adopted the Intergovernmental Committee for World Heritage, which has been at the forefront to address the threat of climate change to world heritage since 2005, followed a petition of concerned organizations and individuals to eventually develop a policy document on the impacts of climate change on world heritage. And then that was the points from this was then integrated into the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention. So it has become that sort of mainstreams the climate change concerns into the daily processes of the management of World Heritage properties. And this document was adopted as these guiding documents for 194 states parties, protect 1,157 cultural, natural, and mixed sites inscribed on the World Heritage List. Currently, there is an update of this document that is ongoing to remain relevant in the world. This 2007 policy on climate change then has been undergoing a lot of revision and consideration to address especially the more recent knowledge and awareness and science that has brought us to where we are today. So In 2020 and 2021, the UNESCO World Heritage, with the assistance of a technical advisory group of experts, revised this, and then the World Heritage Committee, there was a panel of experts that was organized in March 2022, and currently that also made revisions to this document, and then an open-ended working group of states parties to the World Heritage Convention is currently considering the text in view of its final adoption, which we hope would happen in November of this year. ICOMOS, along with ICOMOS and IPCC, the UNESCO ICOMOS IPCC co-sponsored an expert meeting on culture, heritage, and climate change was organized in December 2021, bringing together more than 100 experts and various concerned and knowledge bearers, you might say, of different types from across the world, developing strategic recommendations to contribute to the integration of culture and heritage into the international climate agenda, primarily focusing on issues around the systemic connections of culture, heritage, and climate change, looking at loss, damage, and adaptation for cultural and heritage, and the role of cultural heritage in bringing about transformative change and alternative sustainable futures. During the Mondial Cult, which is the UNESCO World Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development in Mexico City in September 2022, the final declaration encouraged UNESCO to develop operational guidelines on the subject in the framework of UNESCO conventions and recommendations, and including in the 6 major conventions, in synergy and relevant international organizations, frameworks, and mechanisms, looking at the UNEP CCC work on and the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, and the World Meteorological Organization. So together with them to integrate mechanisms for addressing impacts of climate change on cultural and natural heritage, with the aim of assisting member states in the development of their policies and strategies to address extreme climate impacts affecting the entire culture sector. And also the reduction of the carbon footprint. The operational, just to touch on the living heritage aspect and also on emergencies, the safeguarding of living heritage in the context of climate change. Operational principles and modalities for safeguarding intangible cultural heritage in emergencies was adopted by the General Assembly of States Parties in 2020. And there was a dual role here of looking at emergencies as well as the dynamic and adaptive nature of living heritage, looking primarily at the role of communities. And in the protection in emergency situations, in another context, we can see here the initiative on strengthening regional and national policies and capacities in preparing for and responding to climate-induced disasters affecting culture, including the growing impacts of climate change on the culture sector in small island developing states and African countries. So through this UNESCO Emergency Fund, a multi-donor, non-earmarked funding mechanism allows UNESCO to respond quickly and effectively to crises all over the world, and has offered a number of countries whose culture sector has been affected by climate change related events. So for example, the Madagascar post-cyclone damage assessment, the Mozambique building community resilience to climate-related hazards, and Pakistan's needs assessment and technical assistance for cultural assets in flood-affected districts of Swat and Larkana. I want to just run through very quickly so that I can wrap up by talking about a few other examples. Looking at the impact of climate change on the conservation of World Heritage properties. In the past few decades, we have seen an increase in the number of sites being affected by weather-induced disasters and climate change. Reports on the state of conservation of the World Heritage Sites indicate that all types of World Heritage Sites are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change on World Heritage, but there's a growing trend in climate change being addressed in these reports, as you can see from numerous examples and the chart that you saw. The impact of climate change on underwater and coastal heritage is also increasing, with climate change and rising sea levels greatly impacting heritage sites such as Venice or the Swahili site of Kisimani Mafia in Tanzania, sinking into the sea. Prehistoric sites and beaches are washed away. So underwater heritage as well as coastal areas have significant cultural and educational value, but at the same time are facing a lot of impacts that are being addressed through heritage conservation. The impacts of on glaciers, the Sentinels of Climate Change, is a publication that came out recently by UNESCO, looking at glaciers as some of the most valuable indicators for understanding climate change, where around 19,000 glaciers have been identified in 50 World Heritage Sites as showing loss. So this is something that is very important here. And then looking also at the role of Earth observation in being able to understand the changes happening in both in terms of looking at natural heritage and looking at forests, for example, looking at forest sinks, carbon sinks under pressure, looking at forests as carbon sinks, but also an urban heritage climate observatory that has been set up with the Group on Earth Observation, GEO, to understand and document the impacts of climate change on World Heritage cities. Cities themselves are at the heart of a lot of the changes, because out of the 1,157 World Heritage properties currently inscribed on the World Heritage City list, 323 are World Heritage cities, and nearly a third of them are along the coast. And historic cities are particularly at risk because many of them developed for historical reasons along coasts and along major rivers. So during the World Heritage Committee meeting, several of the state of conservation reports have indicated serious threats of climate change to historic cities and these World Heritage cities along the coast. I think that you can see these are through the exchanges with the specific authorities, the site authorities, and seeing the types of impacts that different areas have had. Here are some of the case studies looking at traditional knowledge and being able to see the different types of traditional knowledge and how one can learn from traditional knowledge systems to mitigate and adapt to climate change and increase resiliency. And the World Heritage Canopy website, which provides heritage-based solutions for sustainable futures, that looks at a number of different case studies where there's an integration of blue and green components, and looking at many traditional practices and local knowledges to be able to develop these sorts of solutions that are adapted to heritage and historic areas. And finally, leaving you with a few other publications that UNESCO has on World Heritage and climate change, and looking also at the World Heritage Review on Climate Change, which was published in October 2021, that outlined the potential of culture for climate action, which still remains largely untapped. From tangible and living heritage to museums and creativity, culture represents a wellspring to combat climate change through mitigation and adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jyoti, and I think it's some fascinating work. Thank you for highlighting how the impacts of climate change, what they have on world heritage, including living heritage and the heritage properties, and for highlighting the mechanisms and different fora that are working on preserving that heritage. I believe it might be useful for our audience if you can share a link to the publications so that they can easily reach those publications. I will now move on to Mr. Toddington Harper, who comes from the UAE Global Tolerance Alliance. Mr. Harper, the floor is yours.
It's a huge pleasure to be talking with you today. I'm just going to share a number of slides from this presentation. So hopefully you can see that now. Yeah, really privileged, as I said. My name is Toddington Harper. I'm representing here, was asked to speak on behalf of the Global Tolerance Alliance. My day job is I'm also CEO of an organization called GridServe, which is at the forefront of delivering climate action to retain temperature rises to within 1.5 degrees of warming, in line with the IPCC's recommendations. The reason that I'm privileged to be speaking on behalf of the Global Tolerance Alliance is I was asked to attend and speak at the second edition of the Global Tolerance Alliance on November the 16th last year, marking the International Day of Tolerance, organized under the theme Connected in our Common Humanity. I was also privileged to attend the first edition of the Global Tolerance and Human Fraternity Summit on the 4th anniversary of the signing of the document on human fraternity between His Holiness Pope Francis and the Grand Imam Al-Azhar Ahmed Al-Tayeb. This was held under the patronage and presence of His Excellency Sheikh Nahyan Mubarak Al Nahyan, UAE Cabinet Member and Minister of Tolerance and Coexistence. It's a very special initiative that was hugely beneficial for somebody like me, who is more focused on action around delivery of climate change and less aware and involved in the humanity, the faith aspects, which are equally as important. The Global Tolerance Alliance is a very special initiative. It's a global platform for people to know one another, encouraging dialogue and awareness through the exchange of experiences and joint initiative and projects around the world, and affirming the values of tolerance and human fraternity, with a view to achieving peace, justice, and developing innovative solutions to promote the preservation of human dignity. One of the greatest challenges of our time, which is unfortunately going to be accelerated further by climate change, is for the eradication of intolerance and the promotion of tolerance and equity. And the more that tolerance can allow us to understand and appreciate the differences amongst us, the more likely it is we'll be able to recognize the human values that critically must bind us together. Common ground is possible if we come to know one another as leaders for peace, positive human connections, the well-being of society, and critically for all of us, the adoption of sustainable solutions that would safeguard our shared planet. There are a number of themes brought together at the Global Tolerance Alliance in relation to faith, diversity, peace, and planet. And you can see from this slide here that I was kindly invited to attend the planet aspect of this participation. But it was a very unique experience because I got to share a panel with faith leaders from multiple religions around the world. And further to the comments that were made at the beginning of the presentation, as an example, one of the initiatives that came out of this was the plans that have now led to deliver solar energy solutions to power the beautiful Hindu temple that's currently being built in the UAE. So I think that's a great example of bringing people together around common values, a shared mission, connecting in humanity across, both the private sector, public sector, and different faiths to really advance initiatives that are absolutely critical to protecting our planet. Because as I already highlighted, with climate change, we're already seeing considerable devastation, hardship, and displacement across the world. And on our current path, much worse is expected to come. This risks inflaming global intolerance further, and initiatives that are absolutely critical laid out by the IPCC to reduce global warming to within 1.5 degrees of warming, prevent global warming to above 1.5 degrees of warming, as recommended by the IPCC, are therefore critically important in terms of fostering greater tolerance and protecting the single planet that we live on. And the Global Tolerance Alliance is a fantastic initiative that brings people together. And to talk about initiatives that are absolutely critical, one of the initiatives that I was fortunate to be involved with that came out the planet aspect of this, suggested by faith leaders, is we have very busy lives. We're constantly, we have so much to do, and yet climate change continues in the background constantly and getting worse and worse. And so an initiative was put forward by faith leaders to have a moment of reflection on a monthly basis, to pause for the planet, to take time to consider, to talk, to unplug from the technical devices and technology that's constantly around us, to really think about what are, these huge issues affecting our planet, and what is it that we can do as humanity to come together and take us off the path that we're on today onto a much more sustainable path. I spend my day focusing on solutions that we actually deliver, building solar energy projects to provide clean energy, building charging infrastructure to charge electric cars and enable the mass migration into electric vehicles. But such an initiative of the Global Tolerance Alliance also helps us understand, and help provide greater connectivity to promote greater tolerance, peace, equity, and sustainability across borders. And why is this so important? And I think just, I guess summarizing with an extract from the recent IPCC synthesis report, it's so important. We live in a very, very unique period in history. We have a very unique opportunity. This is an opportunity that only our generation has the ability to do something about. We have a carbon budget of around 500 gigatons remaining. That's going to be used up in the next decade or couple of decades unless we take the action. Future generations will judge us for the actions that we take today. And it's absolutely clear then that the choices that we make today will reverberate for hundreds, even thousands of years. And so it's really, really important that we take the necessary action to address climate change. We listen to the scientific consensus around the IPCC, but critically, above and beyond, or in line with all of this, we need to come together better as mankind to provide greater tolerance for the challenges that we all face and greater unity in addressing these challenges. And the Global Tolerance Alliance is an incredibly important initiative in helping humanity to come together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Toddington, and thank you for sharing with us a local example of tolerance and an entity that is working on combating increasing global intolerance, especially due to climate change. And thank you for providing some real examples of faith-based leadership working on these climate issues. I will now move on and see if we have any questions for our panelists. As far as I can see, some questions have been answered in the chat, and we unfortunately had to say goodbye to Mr. Benjamin Schachter. But if our audience has any questions, it would be great if they could put them in the chat right now. We can maybe take some time for that. Otherwise, at the moment, I don't see any questions. So if maybe we can go into some final remarks or comments from our panelists, and then maybe we can come to a close. Perhaps we can start with Dr. Iyad.
Thank you, Saif, and thanks to all the other panelists. I have learned a lot. And of course, there are so many common areas that we converge and work on. For example, we are partners with UNESCO on religion, culture, and the environment. This is an initiative that we are launching this year that will consider the cultural and religious aspects of climate change. We're also working with the Office of the Human Rights. Again, as was mentioned, it is a human rights issue, the access to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And we are launching a program that is called the Human-Nature Relationship, which will integrate the issues of human rights and climate justice, social justice, and other human rights impacts or elements into living in harmony with nature. And I have been privileged to attend the Human Fraternity Conference, and I gave a keynote address, and I, of course, have communicated with the Ministry of Tolerance. We're engaging with them on organizing COP28 as well as key players, integrating the role of religion. So I'm very happy that we are all talking the same language and we are moving towards the same goal. Thank you.
Thank you. If we can go to to Dr. Jyoti, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that for UNESCO, our objectives with regard to heritage and culture are very clear. We are promoting peace, we're promoting cultural diversity, and we're supporting countries to be able to achieve that. And this means looking not only, if you have to achieve peace and sustainable development and cultural diversity, it means you're really climate change and all the related disasters have to be addressed, not only looking at sort of scientific knowledges and sort of statistical data around technological solutions, but looking also at culture, the impact on culture and culture as a resource for solving some of the problems for society, to provide solutions that are rooted in traditional local knowledges, including indigenous knowledges, and those are the practices that we would like to be able to bring to the fore, to engage culture as a positive resource for long-term solutions and strategies, as much as protecting them as they're impacted by climate change. So it's this dual role. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jyoti. And if we can go to Mr. Toddington.
So I think just repeating the messages from the Global Tolerance Alliance about the importance of faith, diversity, peace, and the planet, and us working in harmony. And I think just repeating the final statement again, which came from the IPCC synthesis report, that our choices will reverberate for hundreds, even thousands of years. We have a very unique opportunity living at this particular era in time to make the right choices. And it's very, very important that we do. We seize the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to all our panelists. As just as a note regarding our webinar, unfortunately, we will be taking a pause. Our webinar series has been running since January, and we've been holding our sessions every Wednesday since. Unfortunately, for Ramadan, we'll be taking a break, and so we should be expecting further sessions sometime in April. Thank you, everyone who participated. Thank you to our panelists. It's been a real pleasure. I personally have learned a lot, and I'm sure that our audience has as well. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you at the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye.